Welcome everyone. In this video, we'll be focusing on common terminologies in epidemiology. Now, let's start with our first terminology, epidemiology itself. Now, as we've discussed previously, epidemiology is basically the study of the distribution, determinants, and dynamics of health and disease-related events in specific populations, and the use of that knowledge to control health-related problems. Okay, so basically, now, anytime you hear epidemiology, think of two things. Okay, determinants and distribution. When we say determinants, we are looking at the factors behind the occurrence of diseases. So the focus of epidemiology is to understand how diseases are distributed and then the reasons behind the occurrence of the diseases. And now to use that knowledge or to apply that knowledge, okay, in the control of health-related problems. That is basically epidemiology. Okay, so epidemiology simply studies how diseases are distributed. Apart from that, what causes those diseases and how can we use that knowledge to control the occurrence of the disease or prevent the occurrence of the disease in population. That is basically epidemiology. Okay, and like I've been saying all the time, think of epidemiologists as investigators or detectives or health detectives. Okay, they investigate. So they basically investigate who is getting sick or who is getting or suffering from an illness. Okay, what condition are we even talking about? What is the cause of the condition? Okay, when did the illness occur? Where did it occur? And why? What are the reasons behind the occurrence? Okay. So basically, epidemiologists usually ask these questions: the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. Is that okay? So that's basically what epidemiology is about. Epidemiologists are detectives that are interested in who is getting sick, what is the disease, what kind of illness are we even talking about, where is it occurring? Is that okay? When did it occur, as in the time, and then why did it occur? Is that okay? So basically, that is all that epidemiology is about. So for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, you remember epidemiologists were behind the track and they track who was getting infected, who was suffering, which people were getting infected by COVID-19, where why was the virus spreading fast, or where was the condition even spreading so fast, in which areas, okay, which interventions were being taken, or which measures were being taken, okay, like the mask, the vaccination, okay, all those interventions that were taken to make a difference. Okay, and all these are just about epidemiology. Now, another example is, you remember in Ghana, public health experts, they usually use epidemiology to study disease conditions like malaria, to understand the trend, how many people are suffering from malaria, which regions are reporting higher numbers, which regions are reporting, very low numbers. Is that okay? Trying to figure out which regions have the most cases, which regions have the least reported cases. Okay, what environmental factors are behind? All these things are just about epidemiology. Is that okay? Good. So you can also see that epidemiology is more like a compass. It's like a compass that points us towards the source of a problem, and then the path, to the solution, the path to. So it's like a compass that will let us know, okay, this is the problem, this is where it is occurring. It occurred during this time. Okay, then epidemiologists will further give us a path to the solution. So it's like a compass that let us know where the problem is coming from, the magnitude and all that, and then also the path to getting solutions to the problem. Okay, basically that is all that epidemiology is about. Now, the next terminologies we are going to look at prevalence and then incidence. Now, these two terminologies, they usually go together in epidemiology, prevalence and incidence. Okay, they go hand in hand, but then they measure different things in epidemiology. Now, what is prevalence? When we say prevalence, basically prevalence tells us how many people currently have a disease. Okay, how many people currently have a disease. But incidence, on the other hand, incidence tells us how many new cases occurred over time. Okay, so you see there are two different things. So prevalence is telling us currently. Okay, so it's going to tell us that, okay, so right from the beginning till now, currently, how many people currently have a particular disease from the beginning, so old plus new. But incidence tells us how many new cases occurred over a certain period of time. How many new cases? Okay, so prevalence is about the proportion of a population with a particular disease or a condition at a specific point in time or over a specified period of time. Okay, but the basis of prevalence is that the focus is on old plus new cases. Is that okay? Great. Then incidence is just about how many new cases occurred over time. Okay, now we can ask you, we even have what we call point prevalence, and then we have period prevalence. Okay, point prevalence can be point prevalence, then we are looking at new plus old cases in a specific point in time. But period prevalence, we can specify a certain period for you to give us the prevalence. Okay, so we can ask you the prevalence of, let's say, malaria between the year, let's say, 2024 to 2025. You see, we are asking you to specify the prevalence within a certain period. But the point prevalence, okay, a specific period of time. So for example, what's the prevalence of, let's say, malaria as at 2025? Let's say November. So as at 2025, let's say November. Then you are coming to give us the old cases plus, the new cases plus the existing or old cases within that point in time. Okay, that's basically what we mean by prevalence. Now, another point is when we say incidence is just the number of new cases of a disease occurring in a defined population during a specified period of time. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So for example can be, you can imagine a community with, let's say, 1,000 people. Okay, and 100 are living with hypertension right now. So let's say there is a community. They are about 1,000 people and 100 people are living with hypertension right now. That means that 10%, there is 10% prevalence. So 10% of the population are living with what? With hypertension. Okay, because 100 over 1,000, you multiply by 100. Is that okay? Great. So basically that is it. So if you have a community of, let's say, 1,000 people, the 1,000 people, and then 100 of them are living with hypertension right now. That means that 10% of the population are living with hypertension. Now, let's assume that same community, if 20 new people develop hypertension this month, let's say 20 new people have developed hypertension this month alone, that is the incidence. Okay, that's the incidence of hypertension in that community. Okay, good. So the new cases that have occurred, that is what we mean by the incidence. Okay, so remember during the COVID-19 time, the prevalence was how many people were affected at a given time, and the incidence was how many new infections were occurring each day. So if you take each particular day, the new cases that were occurring, that is the incidence of COVID-19. Okay, but throughout the period of, the occurrence of that pandemic, throughout the whole period, okay, the cases, the old or existing cases plus the new cases forms the prevalence. Okay, so sometimes in some literatures they will tell you that prevalence is like a snapshot. Okay, prevalence is like a snapshot. Okay, what is happening now? Prevalence is like a snapshot. Okay, incidence is like a video. Okay, what is changing over time? Because you see, prevalence is a snapshot because we give you a specific point in time. Okay, what's the prevalence of, let's say, COVID-19? Let's say today. You are going to tell us the old cases plus the new cases as at that point in time. But when we say incidence, even as at the time you are telling us a new case is recorded, you have to add it as incidence. So incidence is not a snapshot. Incidence is like a video. You can liken it to taking a video. Okay, but prevalence is a snapshot. Okay, great. So basically that is it about prevalence and incidence. Now the next terminology we'll look at is communicable diseases. Communicable disease. Now what is a communicable disease? A communicable or infectious disease, you can call it infectious disease, is one that can spread from one person to another, either through the air, through contact, through water, or vectors like mosquitoes. That is what we call communicable disease. So a communicable or infectious disease is one that can spread from one person to another person. Okay, through either air, through physical contact, through water, or vectors like mosquitoes. That is a communicable disease. Okay, an example can be flu. Flu spreads when someone coughs near you. That's a typical example of a communicable disease. And you know, malaria also spread through mosquito bites. That's an infectious disease. Is that okay? Good. So if a disease can move from me to you, it can move from me to you, that disease is a communicable disease. Okay, so basically a condition that is caused by an infectious agent that can be transmitted from one host or source to another. That is what we call communicable diseases. Now let's look at the next terminology, which is case definition. Case definition. So we will look at, first of all, we even have to understand when we say case in epidemiology, what does it mean? Okay, then we look at case definition. Now, in epidemiology, when we say a case means a person who is identified as having a particular disease or a condition. In epidemiology, anytime you hear case simply means a person who is identified as having a particular disease or having a particular condition. That is a case. So if we identify someone to be having tuberculosis, that a person is a case of tuberculosis in epidemiology. Okay, good. Now, what is case definition? Case definition, more like it gives us the exact criteria. Okay, so when we say a case definition in public health or in epidemiology, it's like a specific criteria that specifies or that defines or outlines symptoms, test results, and time frame based on which we can decide who is counted as a case or who is considered as a case. So when we say a case definition is like a standard criteria, a set of standard criteria, which may include, let's say, some symptoms or some clinical features, some diagnostic investigations or findings or reports, okay, based on which we can make a conclusion that this person, okay, should be considered or counted as having a particular condition. That is what we call case definition. Okay, so it's a set of standard criteria used to decide whether an individual should be classified as a case in epidemiologic investigation. That is a case. So an example can be, for example, for cholera. Okay, a case in cholera could be any person with acute watery diarrhea in a known outbreak area. Okay, so someone who is having or suffering from or experiencing acute watery diarrhea in a known outbreak area, that person is considered a case for cholera. Is that okay? Now, another example can be, let's say, during the COVID-19, a case might be defined as anyone with, let's say, fever, cough, and a positive PCR test. Such a person will be considered as what? As a case. Okay, so a case is more like an exact criteria or a standard criteria that specifies the signs and symptoms or the test results or even the time frame, okay, which we can consider to decide who is counted as a case for a particular disease. That is what we call case definition. Okay, and usually in epidemiology, if you are going to do investigation, your case definition should be very clear, because if your case definition is not clear, your data will not be trusted. You wouldn't even be able to get the cases. And that's the reason why anytime there is any outbreak, usually health authorities or health bodies within the region or the country, they will come up with a case definition that if you see someone with this signs, with this particular signs, that person is having the condition. So all the time in epidemiologic studies, the case definition should be very clear, so that once you know someone having those signs, quickly that person is considered as a case for that condition. Now, the next thing we will look at is what we call chain of infection. Now, when we say chain of infection, what comes into your mind? Chain of infection is more like a sequence of events by which an infectious agent moves from its reservoir through modes of transmission and entry into a susceptible host. Okay, so when we say chain of transmission, okay, now mostly, disease don't appear out of nowhere. They usually follow a certain sequence. You see, someone will not just wake up and you have a disease. The occurrence of a disease usually emerges out of a certain sequence, and that sequence is what we call chain of infection in epidemiology. Now, usually chain of infections usually has 6 links. We have the agent, which is the organism behind the causative organism most of the time. We have the reservoir, where the causative organism will usually live or stay. We have the portal of exit. We have what we call mode of transmission. We have what we call portal of entry. And we have the susceptible host. So a typical example, if you take a condition like malaria, the agent for malaria is a parasite. Okay, the reservoir is humans. Okay, and then the mode of transmission is through mosquito bites. Okay, so before someone gets infected with malaria, you see, it goes through a certain cycle. It goes through certain sequence before the disease finally occurs in the person. That sequence that it goes through is what we call chain of transmission. Okay, another example is COVID-19. Let's use the same COVID-19. Okay, so COVID-19 droplets are mode of transmission. The droplets, so an infected person, the droplets from an infected person, that's the mode of transmission. Okay, and your nose or mouth are the portals of entry. Okay, now you see, we mentioned the links or the various concepts that comes to play in a chain of infection for all kinds of disease. There are some disease they will not use all of them. Okay, but remember that on the chain of transmission, the chain of infection, we have 6 links: the agent, the reservoir, the portal of exit, the mode of transmission, okay, the portal of entry, and then the susceptible host. Okay, so every infection usually go through a certain chain which involves the 6 links. Once you are talking about communicable disease, the chain of infection. Okay, so the agents or the causative organism behind the condition, the reservoir, where the organism will go and live. Okay, the portal of exit. Is that okay? The mode of transmission, the portal of entry, and then the susceptible host. These are the 6 links of events that are involved in chain of infection for all infectious conditions. Okay, now the next thing that we are going to look at, we will look at what we call the so like I was saying, you see, the chain of infection, we have the agent, we have the mode of transmission. So the agent is the biological or physical or chemical factor whose presence is sufficient quantity is necessary to cause a disease, or is necessary for a disease to occur. Now, the mode of transmission is the mechanism or the pathway by which an agent moves from its reservoir to a susceptible host. Then we have the agent. The agent is the causative organism, the microorganisms, or the chemical factor, or any other factor, okay, whose presence or action is essential for the occurrence of a disease. Now, the host is the living organism, the person or the animal that can be infected by the agent, in which the agent can multiply or persist. Then we have the susceptible host, a person lacking sufficient immunity or resistance to a particular infectious agent, making them more likely to develop a disease when they are exposed or upon exposure. Is that okay? So basically, that is it about the chain of infection. Okay, so there are 6 links that comes to play when you talk of chain of infections. So the agent, the reservoir, the portal of exit, the mode of transmission, the portal of entry, and then the susceptible host. Okay, good. So like I said, for if you take malaria, the host is the person, the agent is the Plasmodium parasite. Okay, and then the environment includes the standing water where mosquitoes usually breed. Okay, so you see we have for example, if you take food poison, for example, the host is the person who has been poisoned. Okay, the agent is the Salmonella typhi bacteria. Okay, and then the environment is more of the improperly stored food. That is where you talk about the environment. Okay, now one key thing you need to remember is that in a situation where there is no agent, okay, you should know that there is no disease. Okay, and in a situation where there is no host, so when you have no agent, you have no disease, you have no host, you have no home. Is that okay? It's some terms that you need to get in epidemiology. Okay, so when there is no agent, of course there is no, the agent is like the causative mechanism. So if there is no causative mechanism, don't expect the occurrence of a disease. Okay, and then there wouldn't be any host at all. Is that okay? Good. Now the next terminology we'll look at is carrier and incubation period. Now in epidemiology, when we say a carrier is someone who has the disease agent but does not show symptoms. Okay, but the other side of a carrier is that they can still spread the disease. Okay, so someone who has the disease, the agent of the disease, but does not show symptoms, yet they can spread the disease. That is a carrier. Is that okay? So an individual who harbors the infectious agent, yet does not show symptoms, but can transmit the disease to others. Okay, so we can have healthy carriers, you can have convalescent carrier, you can have incubatory carriers. Is that okay? So when we say a healthy carrier never becomes ill. Okay, so they can harbor, they are carriers, they harbor the causative agent, but they never become ill. They are asymptomatic, they don't show any symptoms of the disease. We can have what we call convalescent carrier. They remain infectious during the recovery period. Okay, so even during the time that they are recovering, they still can transmit the condition to other people. Okay, then we have incubatory or precocious carrier. They transmit during the incubation period. Okay, so we can have a situation or a time during the incubation period. The incubation period is the time between the exposure, when you are exposed to the causative organism, the agent, and when the symptoms first appear. Okay, so like few days between catching flu and feeling of fever or feeling feverish. Okay, that period is what we call the incubation period. There are some people during the incubation period, they can transmit. There are some conditions that some people can suffer where during the incubation period, they can actually infect other people. Okay, good. So incubatory carriers, they transmit during incubation period. Then we have the next terminology we will look at is what we call contact. Okay, so when we say a contact is a person or an animal that has been exposed to an infected individual or animal or contaminated environment, and that has the possibility of developing the disease. So in epidemiology, when we say someone is a contact, all it means is that that person has come into contact with an infected person. Okay, it could be an animal, it could be an individual. So the person has been has been exposed. Okay, if you say exposed, meaning the person has come into contact with an infected individual or an infected animal before, then we say that person is a contact. So, for example, if someone is having COVID-19 and you happen to have stayed with the person for some time, you are a contact in public health. Okay, because you have been exposed to someone who is infected. So you are a contact. So in epidemiology, a contact is a person or an animal that has been exposed to an infected individual or another animal or even a contaminated environment. And that person has the possibility, there are chances that such a person who is the contact can develop the disease. Is that okay? So that is what we call contact. Sometimes in epidemiology, we do what we call contact tracing. When we say contact tracing, meaning you are following up to go and find out people who have been exposed to infected people. Contact tracing. Is that okay? Great. So basically, that is it for the common terminologies for the first section. Okay, so we've looked at words like prevalence. So in summary, like we mentioned, when we say prevalence simply means with prevalence we are looking at the old plus new cases. Is that okay? And then with incidence we are looking at the new cases. So if you look at these diagrams, you can see the incidence is talking about, where the water is directly coming from the source. The new cases, the new ones that are coming, refers to the incidence. And then the new ones plus the ones that are already in existence refers to the prevalence. Now, one interesting thing about epidemiology is that, so you see the last diagram, you could see the incident cases is flowing, new cases that are coming is the incidence. Prevalence, the new cases plus the old cases, prevalence. Now, one thing about the prevalence is, within the prevalence, you can have some cases that will die and some of the cases that will recover. Is that so? If you look at the first diagram, you could see the deaths. That's what we call mortality. And you see the recovery. So within the prevalence, within the new and old people who have the disease, some will recover from the disease, some will die. Those who will die is what we refer to as the mortality. Is that okay? Great. Good. So basically, that is it for some terminology. So prevalence tells us how many people currently have a disease. Incidence tells us how many new cases occurred over a period of time. Okay. Now, another thing that we look at is communicable diseases. So a communicable or an infectious disease is one that can spread from one person to another person, either through the air, through contact, through water, or even vectors like mosquitoes. Okay. We also looked at we looked at epidemiology itself. Okay, and we mentioned epidemiology basically focuses on how diseases are distributed, what causes diseases, and how we can use that knowledge to control or prevent diseases in populations. Is that okay? Great. And then we look at case definition. And I mentioned that case definition is more like a standard, criteria, okay, or a specific criteria or an exact criteria that actually specifies the symptoms or the test results or diagnostic findings or the time frame based on which we can decide who is counted as a case. And I mentioned that when we say a case in epidemiology, a case means a person identified as having a particular disease or a particular condition. Is that okay? That is what we refer to as a case in epidemiology. So when we say a case definition, so for example, we use cholera as an example. That, for example, if you take cholera, a case could be someone, it could be any person with acute watery diarrhea in a known outbreak area. Such a person will be considered as a case for cholera. Okay. Now, another thing that you need to also remember is the chain of infection. So chain of infection is like a sequence of events that will occur before someone suffers an infection. Okay. Or someone become ill as a result of an infectious condition. And I mentioned that the chain of infection has 6 links. The links, we have the agent, which is usually the causative organism, either a virus, a bacteria, either a chemical agent, either an environmental agent or a physical agent. Then we have the reservoir, okay, where the agent will live. Okay, we have the portal of exit, we have the mode of transmission, we have the portal of entry, and then we have a susceptible host. Is that okay? Great. Then we look at these terminology. We look at host, the agent, the environment. We gave examples that if you say, and these three things, they are classic, concept in epidemiology: the host, the agent, and environment. Okay, so for example, for malaria, the host is the person, the agent is the plasmodium parasite, and the environment includes the standing water where mosquitoes usually breed. Okay, if you take food poisoning, for example, the host is the person who is suffering from the food poisoning. The agent is the bacteria that is involved, or the chemical or whatever that is involved. The environment is the improperly stored food. That becomes the environment. Okay, and I mentioned that in epidemiology, if you say there is no agent, in fact there is no disease, and that also means there is no host. Is that okay? That's something you need to understand in epidemiology. Okay, so for now, let's end here with the common terminologies in epidemiology. Okay, so we will continue in our next video. All the best. Bye bye.